This is a story about the quiet space between two people, where love is not a lightning strike, but a slow-growing vine, rooted in the solid ground of respect. It is a promise that tenderness can be found not in grand declarations, but in the careful way a hand is offered, and the even more careful way it is accepted. For those who believe intimacy is built in the spaces between words, in shared silence and simple, honored vows, this is for you. Silas Cole measured his days in the steady rhythm of solitude. Sunrise brought the scrape of his boot on the porch step, the low complaint of the well pump, the singular clink of his coffee cup against the saucer. His homestead, carved from the stubborn prairie, was a testament to order. Fences ran straight, the woodpile was stacked tight and high, and the house itself, though built for a family he no longer had, was kept with a kind of fierce, lonely cleanliness. Dust had no place to settle here, nor did memory, if he could help it. He moved through the two-bedroom cabin like a ghost in his own life, his footsteps the only sound to disturb the thick quiet. In the evening, the lamplight cast a single shadow on the wall, and the bed he slept in was always cold on one side. He did not think of it as loneliness. He thought of it as peace. It was a peace he had purchased at a great cost, and he guarded it as jealously as he guarded his land. He listened to the wind, to the call of a distant hawk, to the creak of aging timber, and found the world's noise sufficient. He had no need for a human voice to complicate the silence. The mail rider, a boy who came once a month with letters for other people, and supplies for him, was the only person he spoke to, and their exchanges were limited to a nod and a handful of coins. So when the boy reined in his horse on a blistering August afternoon, not with a sack of flour, but with a wagon carrying a passenger, the entire, painstakingly constructed rhythm of Silas's life stuttered to a halt. The woman who sat on the wagon bench was cloaked in dust and exhaustion, her hands folded tightly in the lap of a dark, worn dress. She held herself with a ramrod straightness that spoke of a pride that had outlasted whatever comfort she'd once known. When the boy stammered an introduction, a name Mrs. Elara Vance, and a jumbled explanation involving a letter from a distant cousin and a prepaid arrangement, Silas felt the foundations of his quiet world crack. He had not been expecting a housekeeper. The letter he'd received had been terse, speaking of a suitable match and a widow of good character in need of a home. He'd read it as a proposal for a wife, a practical arrangement to fill the echoing silence of his house, a notion he'd considered and dismissed a dozen times. But this woman, stepping down from the wagon with a careful, deliberate grace, looked at him not with the hopeful eyes of a bride, but with the wary assessment of someone preparing for a fight. Her gaze swept over the homestead, the solid house, and then settled on him, her expression unreadable. The silence that stretched between them was of a different quality than the one he was used to. It was not peaceful. It was fraught, heavy with questions and the vast, unspoken histories of two strangers meeting at the edge of the world. The late afternoon sun beat down, throwing their long shadows together on the dry earth. The peace was broken. In its place was a presence, a complication, a woman named Elara. Elara felt his eyes on her, a steady, unblinking regard that was neither welcoming nor unkind. It was simply watchful. The man Silas Cole, the mail boy had called him, was carved from the same hard material as the land itself. Tall and broad, with hands that looked capable of both gentling a horse and splitting an oak log, he stood on his porch as if he'd grown there. He said nothing, waiting. It was a silence she knew well, the kind that demanded you be the first to speak, to reveal your need. She would not. She had learned long ago that the first person to speak was the first to lose ground. The letter from her late husband's cousin had promised a position, a place where her skills in managing a household would be valued, where she could earn her keep and maintain her dignity. It had mentioned a widower, a man of property, but the word housekeeper had been plain. Yet the look on this man's face was one of profound confusion. as if she were a delivery he had not ordered. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am Elara Vance. I believe you are expecting me." His nod was clipped. I was. I was not. The contradiction hung in the air. He stepped down from the porch, his boots making soft thuds in the dust. He was closer now, and she could see the lines of sun and sorrow etched around his eyes. He wasn't an old man, but he was one who had lived a long time in a short number of years. "The letter I received," he said, his voice a low rumble, "spoke of a wife." Elara's breath caught in her throat. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. It was a trap, then. A trick of words to deliver her into another man's possession. Her spine stiffened, the pride that was her only real armor snapping into place. "The letter I answered," she replied, her tone matching his for its lack of adornment, spoke of a housekeeper. "It seems we have both been misled." He considered this, his gaze never leaving her face. He was reading her, she realized, in the way a man might read the sky for rain. He was looking for deceit, for weakness. He would find neither. "That does seem to be the case," he said at last. He gestured toward the wagon, where her single battered trunk sat. "You've come a long way." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, one that acknowledged her vulnerability without preying on it. "I have," she confirmed. "The mail rider can take you back to town in the morning," he offered. "I'll give him the fare." The offer was honorable. It gave her a way out, a clean retreat. But a retreat to what? A room she couldn't afford in a town where she knew no one, where a lone woman was either a target or a temptation. She had spent her last dollar on the journey here, gambling on the promise of honest work. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked, the question a challenge. "On the terms I agreed to?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the second window of the cabin, the one that had remained dark and shuttered for years. "The house has a spare room. The work is here to be done. If you want it." It was not a welcome. It was a concession. But within it, she heard something vital, a choice. He was giving her the power to decide. "I will earn my keep, Mr. Cole," she said, her chin lifting. "I will be no man's burden." He gave another of his short, decisive nods. "The room is yours. The work is yours to manage as you see fit." He turned then and lifted her trunk from the wagon as if it weighed nothing. He did not ask for permission, but his movements were careful, respectful of her property. He carried it to the porch and set it down gently. He did not cross the threshold. He waited for her to enter first. In that small, silent gesture, Elara Vance felt the first flicker of something she had not allowed herself to hope for, the possibility of safety. The first days passed in a state of quiet, formal negotiation. They were two planets orbiting the same sun, the hearth careful not to collide. Silas rose before dawn, his routine unchanged. He would light the stove, put the coffee on to boil, and be out to the barn before Elara emerged from her room. He found the new rhythm unsettling. The scent of lavender soap from her room, the soft rustle of her skirts as she moved through the main room, the way the house no longer felt entirely his. It was an invasion, but a quiet one. He ate the meals she prepared in silence. She was a good cook. The bread was light, the stew rich. It was better than his own grimly functional fare, and the warmth of it in his belly was an unfamiliar comfort. He would clear his own plate, wash it in the basin, and retreat to the porch or his workshop, leaving the kitchen and the evening to her. He watched her. He was a man accustomed to watching for predators in the long grass, for signs of blight on his crops, for the shift in the wind that signaled a storm. Now he watched her. He watched the way her hands were never still, always mending, kneading, or scrubbing. He saw the faint tremor in them when she thought he wasn't looking, a ghost of past fear. He saw the proud set of her shoulders as she hung his laundered shirts on the line, the crisp white fabric snapping in the breeze. One morning he came in for water and found her at the table, her brow furrowed in concentration over one of his worn shirts, a needle flashing in her hand. The stitches she made were small and neat, a line of perfect, ordered care closing a tear near the cuff. He had intended to mend it himself with his own clumsy, thick-fingered stitches. He stood in the doorway, silent, watching the gentle efficiency of her work. She looked up, startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry. I should have asked." "It's fine," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He walked to the basin, dipped his cup, and drank. The water was cool against his dry throat. He could feel her eyes on his back. "It's a good mend." She did not reply, but when he turned, the tension in her shoulders had eased slightly. Later that day, he came in from the fields, sweat and dust clinging to him. He was used to the heat, but the sun had been relentless. He saw 2 glasses of lemonade sitting on the kitchen table, beads of condensation running down their sides. One was for her. The other, he knew, was for him. He paused, looking at the offering. It was a simple thing, a gesture of civility. But in the silent, careful world they were building, it felt like a treaty. He took the glass and drank. It was tart and sweet and cold. He looked over at her, where she sat darning a sock. He lifted the glass in a small, almost imperceptible gesture of thanks. She met his eyes and gave a small, hesitant nod in return. That evening, as he prepared to go out for his final check of the livestock, he noticed her shawl had fallen from its peg by the door. He picked it up. The wool was soft, worn thin in places. He folded it carefully and placed it on the back of her chair. He did not say a word as he left. It was a conversation held in gestures, a language of quiet consideration that was beginning to feel more natural to him than words ever had. Elara learned the landscape of Silas Cole's silence. There was the silence of concentration when he repaired a harness, his hands moving with an intuitive grace. There was the weary silence of dusk, when he would sit on the porch and watch the last light bleed from the sky. And there was the guarded silence he wore like a cloak, a barrier against a world that had, she suspected, taken a great deal from him. She respected it. She had her own silences, her own locked rooms in the house of her memory. Their shared quiet was not empty. It was a space they were furnishing together, carefully, with small acts of service. She learned to have hot coffee ready when he came in from the barn. He learned to leave a bucket of fresh, clean water for her just inside the door each morning. One afternoon, she was struggling to decipher the scribbled records in his supply ledger. The handwriting was nearly illegible, a scrawl of a man unused to holding a pen. She saw him hesitating in the doorway, a flicker of something like shame in his eyes. "The words," he said, the admission costing him. "I'm not strong with them. Numbers are clear. Words are a tangle." Elara looked from the page to his face. Here was a man of immense capability, who could read the land and the sky, who could build and fix and grow anything, and he was admitting a vulnerability to her. It was a gift of trust, more precious than any jewel. "My father taught me my letters," she said softly. "He was a schoolteacher. I could help you organize these if you like, and perhaps teach you if you wished it." She held her breath, worried she had overstepped, that she had wounded his pride. He was quiet for so long, she thought he would refuse. Then he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "All right," he said, his voice low. And so began a new routine. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the dishes cleared, they would sit at the kitchen table under the soft glow of the oil lamp. She would guide his large, calloused hand as he formed the letters, his touch surprisingly gentle. He was a slow, methodical student, his brow furrowed in the same intense concentration he applied to fixing a fence. She found a quiet joy in it, in the shared purpose. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a man less stoic and more weary. One night, he finally managed to write his own name in a clear, if shaky, script. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked up at her, his dark eyes holding hers. The air in the small kitchen grew thick, charged with an unspoken current. The only sounds were the hiss of the lamp and the frantic beat of her own heart. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push the ledger toward the center of the table, a small gesture that somehow closed the distance between them. "Thank you, Elara," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice was a new kind of touch, one that she felt from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. In that moment, the arrangement between them shifted. They were no longer just a man and his housekeeper. They were Silas and Elara, two lonely people learning a new language together in the quiet of a prairie night. A late summer storm rolled in without warning, the sky turning a bruised purple. Rain came down in sheets, drumming a frantic rhythm on the cabin roof. Silas, who had been reinforcing the corral, came in soaked to the bone, water sluicing from the brim of his hat. Elara met him at the door with a dry towel, an unspoken habit they had developed. As he toweled his hair, a steady drip, drip, drip echoed from the corner of the main room. They both looked up. A dark stain was spreading on the ceiling above her bedroom door. "Damn," Silas muttered, the curse a soft rumble of frustration. He went into her room, Elara following. A small but persistent leak had formed directly over her bed, the water pooling on her quilt. He ran a hand through his damp hair. "I thought I'd fixed that patch last spring." He looked from the leak to the narrow bed, then at her. The cabin was small. There was his room, and there was hers. There was nowhere else for her to go. The storm raged outside, a wall of sound and water. "The roof is sound in my room," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You take the bed. I'll take the floor." It was the honorable thing to do, the only thing to do. But the thought of him sleeping on the hard floorboards while she took his bed felt wrong. It felt like an imbalance in the delicate equilibrium they had built. She looked at his bed, a sturdy wooden frame he had likely built himself. It was wide enough for two, if two people did not mind the proximity. "That's not necessary," she said, her own voice quiet but firm. "The bed is large enough." The words hung in the air between them, as charged as the lightning that suddenly split the sky, illuminating the room in a stark momentary flash. In the ensuing darkness, she could feel his gaze on her, intense and searching. The thunder that followed was a low, visceral growl. "Elara," he began, his voice strained. "That is not a thing I can ask of you." "You are not asking," she corrected gently. "I am offering. We are two adults seeking shelter from a storm, nothing more." She was testing him, and she knew it. She was testing the foundation of respect he had so carefully laid. She needed to know it was solid, that it would hold. He was silent for a long, taut moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Only if you are certain. I give you my word. No more than sharing warmth." His vow, spoken so plainly, was more reassuring than 1,000 flowery promises. It was solid. It was real. "I am certain," she said. "Yes." The word was a key turning in a lock. Later, after they had both changed into dry nightclothes in their separate rooms, they met in the dim light of his room. The rain still hammered down outside. He had left the lamp burning low on his knitstand. He got into the bed first, moving to the far side, turning his back to her in a gesture of deliberate respect. Elara hesitated for only a second before sliding under the covers on her side. The mattress dipped with her weight. A chasm of cool linen lay between them, but she was acutely aware of him, the heat radiating from his body, the sound of his slow, controlled breathing, the sheer solid presence of him just inches away. She lay stiffly, her hands clasped over her stomach, listening to the storm inside and out. After a few minutes, he spoke, his voice a low murmur against the sound of the rain. "Are you warm enough?" "Yes," she whispered to his back. "Silas?" "Yes." "Thank you." He did not answer, but she felt, more than saw, the slight nod of his head. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, surrounded by the storm, lying next to a man she was just beginning to know, Elara Vance felt completely and utterly safe. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the air washed clean. The quiet inside the cabin, however, was different. It was no longer the silence of solitude or polite distance, but one of deep, shimmering awareness. Elara was awake when Silas rose, feeling the mattress shift as he silently left the bed. When she emerged, he had coffee ready, as always, but he did not meet her eyes immediately. The memory of the night of shared warmth, of his steadfast respect, of the simple, profound trust lay between them, a fragile new thing. They were navigating breakfast when the sound of an approaching buggy broke the morning peace. Elara's hand stilled on her coffee cup. Visitors were a rarity. Silas's face hardened, his posture shifting into one of silent, watchful defense. A portly, well-dressed man pulled his horse to a stop. He climbed down with a proprietary air, his smile not reaching his cold, assessing eyes. Elara's stomach tightened. She knew him. Mr. Finch, the banker from the town she'd left. A man who had known her late husband and had made his own unwelcome intentions clear to her more than once after the funeral. "Mrs. Vance, what a surprise to find you all the way out here," Finch boomed, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. He dismissed Silas with a cursory glance, as if he were nothing more than a hired hand. "I was in the area on business and heard you'd taken a position. I felt it my duty to check on your welfare." His words were coded in false concern. He was checking on his investment, she thought bitterly, seeing if she was now desperate enough to accept his previous dishonorable offers. Silas moved to stand, not in front of her, but beside her, a subtle shift that placed them as a united front. His presence was a solid, reassuring wall. "She is well," Silas said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. Finch's smile tightened. He finally deigned to address Silas. "And you are?" "A landowner, I presume." He looked around the modest but well-kept homestead with a dismissive air. A lonely post for a lovely creature like Mrs. Vance. The way he said creature made Elara feel like livestock being appraised. "Mr. Cole has been a gentleman," she said, her voice firm, drawing Finch's attention back to her. She would not have Silas fight her battles, but she was grateful he was there to witness them. "I'm sure he has," Finch said, his tone oily. "But this is no place for a woman of your refinement. I have a very comfortable home, Elara, a position as my personal hostess. You would want for nothing." The offer was an insult wrapped in silk. He was asking her to be his mistress. Before she could voice the cold refusal forming on her lips, Silas spoke again. "The lady has a home," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of fact. Finch's eyes narrowed, finally recognizing the quiet strength in the man before him. He saw the set of Silas's jaw, the way he stood, rooted and unmovable. He saw the way Elara stood beside him, not behind him, and the subtle message of partnership it conveyed. "We shall see," Finch said, his veneer of civility cracking. He gave Elara one last, proprietary look, then turned on his heel and left. The buggy rattled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a new, more sinister tension in the clean morning air. The unspoken thing between them now had a name: protection. And they both knew the threat was not gone. It had just been given a face. The banker's visit left a sour taste in the air that lingered long after his dust had settled. The comfortable quiet they had built felt fragile now, threatened by the outside world. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavy, not with peace, but with unspoken questions. Elara found she could not eat. She pushed the food around her plate, the memory of Finch's leering gaze making her feel cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. Silas watched her, his own meal untouched. "He will be back," Silas stated. It was not a question. "Yes," she whispered. Men like him believe a woman's no is simply a negotiation. He put his fork down, his hands resting on the table. "You don't have to tell me, but if you want to, I will listen." The invitation was simple, direct. It offered her a space to speak without demanding she fill it. She took a deep, shaky breath. "My husband, he was not a cruel man, but he saw me as something to be owned, a beautiful object to display in his home. When he died, he left me with nothing but debts. Men like Finch saw an opportunity. They think that because a woman is in need, her dignity is for sale." She looked at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "Your respect, Silas. The way you ask before you act, the way you give me choices, it is a language I am only just learning to trust." He listened, his expression unchanging, but his eyes were dark with a deep, still empathy. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of shared understanding. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his own voice low and rough with memory. "This house, I built it for my wife and my son." The admission stunned her. She had assumed he had always been alone. "We were only here a year. The fever came in the winter. It took them both in less than a week." He stared at the far wall, seeing a past she could only imagine. "I buried them myself, up on that ridge." He gestured with his head toward the window. "After that, the quiet was all I wanted. I didn't think I'd ever want to hear another voice in this house again." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the vast, barren landscape of his grief. "Until you came." The confession was stark, stripped of all artifice. He was showing her the wound he had carried, the reason for his solitude. He had shared his sorrow, just as she had shared her fear. She reached across the table, her fingers hesitating for a moment before she laid her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused from work, but beneath it she felt a tremor. He did not pull away. He slowly, carefully, turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. His touch was warm and solid, an anchor in the turbulent waters of their pasts. The lamplight flickered, casting their joined hands in a soft, golden glow. They were no longer just two people sharing the roof. They were two survivors, finding refuge in each other. In the days that followed, a new tenderness bloomed in the space between them. The confessions shared in the lamplight had changed the very air they breathed. Trust, once a tentative seedling, was now putting down deep, strong roots. Elara finished her mending of his torn shirt, the one she had been working on the day he'd first watched her. The stitches were nearly invisible, the fabric whole again. When she laid it, clean and folded, on his bed, it felt less like a chore and more like a prayer for his well-being. She saw him wear it the next day. He didn't mention the repair, but she saw him, more than once, run his thumb over the neat seam at his cuff. It was a silent acknowledgment, a touch that honored her care. One afternoon he came in from his workshop, smelling of sawdust and sweat. He walked to the mantelpiece and set a small object down beside the clock. It was a bird, a wren, carved from a piece of pale, smooth wood. Its head was cocked, its tiny form so exquisitely detailed she could almost imagine it taking flight. He had carved it for her. He said nothing, simply wiped his hands on his trousers and went to the basin to wash. But the gift sat on the mantel, a quiet, solid testament to the hours he had spent thinking of her, his hands shaping a piece of his world into a thing of beauty for hers. The bird became a touchstone for her. In moments of doubt, She would run her finger over its smooth back, feeling the patient, steady care that had gone into its creation. His service had always been his love language, but this was different. This was art. This was a piece of his soul. Elara, in turn, found new ways to show her own care. She noticed he always squinted slightly when reading the almanac by the evening light. The next time the mail rider came, she sent with him a small order, using the money she'd carefully saved from selling some of her excess preserves in town. Weeks later, a small paper-wrapped parcel arrived. That evening, she placed it beside his plate. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a pair of reading spectacles with simple wire frames. He looked at them, then at her, his throat working. He put them on. His eyes, magnified slightly behind the glass, were wide with a surprise that was achingly vulnerable. He picked up the almanac, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face as the letters sharpened into perfect clarity. "Elara," he breathed, the word full of a gratitude so profound it needed no other adornment. He reached for her hand across the table, his grip sure and gentle. He didn't let go. They sat there for a long time, the carved bird watching from the mantel. As the sun went down and the house filled with the comfortable, shared silence of two people who had finally, truly come home. The peace was not to last. Mr. Finch returned, as Silas had predicted he would. This time, he did not come with smiles and false pleasantries. He came with a sheaf of papers in his hand, and two grim-faced men from town flanking him. He stood on the porch, his shadow falling across the doorway where Elara stood, with Silas, a solid presence just behind her shoulder. "Good afternoon, Elara," Finch said, his voice dripping with condescension. He held up the papers. "A matter of some unfinished business. It seems your late husband, a poor man with expensive tastes, signed a promissory note to me. His land, this land, was his collateral." Elara's blood ran cold. It was a lie. Her husband had been foolish, but he had owned this small parcel of land outright, a gift from his father. "That's not possible," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This land was clear." "Paperwork says otherwise," Finch sneered, tapping the documents. "A debt of $500, a considerable sum. However," he continued, his eyes glinting with predatory triumph, "I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to forgive this debt. In exchange for your cooperation," he looked pointedly at Silas, "send this farmhand on his way. You will come back to town with me. You will take up your position in my home. You will be my ward, under my protection, and this unfortunate business will be forgotten." The ultimatum was clear. He was trying to purchase her, using a forged debt as his currency. The threat was no longer just social pressure. It was a direct assault on her home, her safety, and her future with Silas. She felt a tremor of old fear, the familiar dread of a woman with no power, trapped by the whims of a dishonorable man. But then she felt Silas shift behind her. He did not step forward. He did not speak. He simply rested his hand on the small of her back. The touch was light, a mere whisper of contact through the fabric of her dress, but it was grounding. It was a silent message. "You are not alone. I am here. We face this together." The warmth of his hand seeped into her, steadying her, chasing away the fear and replacing it with a cold, clear anger. She had a choice. She had a partner. She was no longer the woman who had arrived here, cloaked in dust and desperation. Finch was waiting, his smirk widening, confident in his victory. He believed he held all the cards. He did not understand that the currency of this house was not money or paper, but trust and honor, things he knew nothing about. The choice was hers to make, but for the first time, she knew she would not be making it alone. Elara drew a slow, steadying breath, the warmth of Silas's hand a solid anchor at her back. She met Mr. Finch's smug gaze, and for the first time in his presence, she felt no fear, only a profound and weary contempt. Finch directed his words to her, deliberately excluding the man beside her. "Well, my dear, the day grows late. Have you made your choice? A comfortable life awaits you." Before she could form a reply, a single word, spoken in a low, quiet tone, cut through the afternoon air. No, it was Silas. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. The word was not a shout of defiance, but a simple, immutable fact, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Finch's face contorted in a flash of anger. He finally turned his full attention on Silas, his voice dripping with scorn. "This is not your affair, farmhand. This is a legal matter between myself and the widow." "This is my home," Silas said, his voice still level, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. "She is not leaving it." He looked at Elara then, a quick, questioning glance. It was not a look seeking permission to act, but one that offered his strength for her to wield. "It is your decision. I will support it." In that silent, steady gaze, she saw everything. The quiet respect, the shared vulnerability, the promise of protection that was not about ownership, but about partnership. She had everything she needed. She turned back to Finch, her own voice ringing with a clarity and strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my home," she repeated Silas's words, making them her own. "And this," she said, reaching back without looking, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together in a firm, undeniable grip, "is my husband?" The word, spoken aloud, settled in the air between them, solid and true. It was a vow, a choice, a declaration of war and of peace, all at once. Finch stared at their joined hands, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The lie was so bold, so unexpected, that it completely dismantled his plan. He had come to prey on a lone, helpless widow. He found, instead, a united couple. He could bluster and threaten, but he had no legal standing to remove a wife from her husband's home, especially with a claim as flimsy as his forged note. He knew it. His two hired men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing a lost cause. "You will regret this," Finch spat, his composure finally shattering. But his threat was hollow. He had lost. He turned, stalking back to his buggy, his impotent rage radiating from the stiff set of his shoulders. Silas and Elara stood on the porch, their hands still clasped, and watched him go. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the quiet space where Finch's threats had been, a new reality had been forged. They had chosen each other, not with rings or a preacher, but with a plain-spoken vow and the unshakable truth of their joined hands. The buggy disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a profound silence. The tension of the confrontation drained away, leaving them both feeling shaky and raw. Silas's hand was still wrapped around hers, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles in a slow, reassuring rhythm. They turned and went back inside, the latch of the door clicking shut behind them with a soft finality. The main room of the cabin, which had felt like a fortress moments before, now felt like a sanctuary. Elara went to the sewing basket, her hands needing a familiar, calming task. She picked up a piece of linen she was hemming, but her fingers were trembling. The needle slipped, pricking the tip of her index finger. A single perfect drop of red welled up. "Ah!" she gasped, more from surprise than pain. Silas was beside her in an instant. "Let me see." His voice was low, gentle. He took her hand, his large, rough fingers surprisingly delicate as he turned it over to inspect the tiny wound. His touch was so careful, so full of a tender concern, that it made her throat tighten. He led her to the kitchen table and sat her down, then went to fetch the water basin and a clean strip of cloth. He knelt before her, placing her hand in his lap. He dipped the cloth in the cool water and began to gently, methodically, clean the small cut. The world narrowed to this single, quiet act of care. The lamplight which she had just lit against the encroaching dusk, cast a warm glow over his bent head, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the unexpected gentleness in his expression. He was tending to her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he was done, he wrapped the small wound with the clean cloth, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He did not let go of her hand right away. He held it, his gaze meeting hers. The air was thick with everything they hadn't said, with the echoes of the vow she had made on the porch. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to her bandaged fingertip. The gesture was so intimate, so full of reverence, it sent a tremor straight through her. He stood and moved to the stove, his back to her. "You must be hungry," he said, his voice a little rough. He began to prepare a simple meal of broth and bread, his movements efficient, but imbued with a new deliberate tenderness. They ate at the kitchen table, the silence between them no longer one of yearning, but of deep, settled peace. He lifted a spoonful of broth to his own lips, then paused. He extended the spoon toward her, an offering. Her eyes met his, and she leaned forward, accepting the food from his hand. It was a simple act, one of profound intimacy, a quiet sealing of the promises made and the care given. In the soft lamplight of the kitchen, they fed each other, two souls tending to each other's wounds, both old and new. A week passed. The memory of Finch's visit faded, leaving behind not a scar of fear, but the solid foundation of the choice they had made. A new rhythm settled over the homestead, an easy domestic harmony that was built on shared glances, comfortable silences, and the simple pleasure of being in the same room. The line between his work and her work blurred into our work. She helped him in the garden, her hands in the soil next to his. He helped her churn the butter, his steady strength making the task easy. The house was no longer a place of solitude for him, or a place of refuge for her. It was simply their home. One bright, clear morning, Elara brought him a cup of water while he was mending a section of fence at the far edge of the property. He stopped his work, taking the cup from her and drinking deeply. He looked out over the cabin, the neat barn, the fields stretching out under the vast blue sky. "I used to think of this place as just the property," he said, his voice thoughtful. "A place to work, a place to be alone." He looked down at her, a soft, rare smile touching his lips. "It needs a better name now." He paused, his gaze full of a deep, quiet affection that made her heart ache with happiness. "Elara's Rest," he said, the words a soft vow. "We should call it that, because that's what you found here, and it's what you gave back to me." Tears pricked her eyes. He was naming the home for her, weaving her into the very fabric of the land, of his life. He was giving her a belonging she had never known. She couldn't speak. She could only smile, a smile so full of love and gratitude it felt as bright as the sun. He set the cup down and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and familiar against hers. He looked into her eyes, his own dark and serious, full of a promise that went deeper than words. "I will keep you warm, Elara," he said, echoing the vow he had made in the storm. But this time it meant so much more than fending off the cold. It meant he would cherish her, protect her, and stand by her. She squeezed his hand, her own promise rising to meet his. "And you are safe here, Silas," she replied. It was a promise to guard his heart, to honor his vulnerabilities, to be the keeper of the peace he had so feared to lose and had now found again with her. He lifted her hand, the one with the still fading prick on the finger, and pressed his lips to her palm. It was a kiss of devotion, a seal on their unspoken vows. There, under the wide open sky, with the home they had built together standing behind them, they had everything they needed. It was not a future of grand passion and high adventure, but something far more precious, a shared quiet, a named home, and the simple, steadfast promise of a hand to hold. It was enough. It was everything.